Hello again. Let's shift focus on to this. Now, the coverage of news about the African continent by Western media has been a contentious issue for some time now. Is there a bias in the way stories from the continent are told? And is Africa still portrayed as a dark continent? To help us with this, I'm joined in studio by author of a travel memoir titled Vagabond, Lerato Mokgwatle. Lerato, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Thank you very much.
And that's the question, essentially, right? Have we seen a change? We have come some way in the way stories of the continent are told, but is it a good way?
It's not a good way. I think when it comes to the progress that has been made, it's been voices outside of mainstream media. But when you look at mainstream media, when you look at Western media titles, whatever medium that they broadcast on, you will notice that Africa remains inherently a dark continent. And I think that speaks to greater issues, to not recognizing the humanity of Africans, to just generally Western media being anti-black, being anti-African, and consistently feeding into the stereotype of Africa as the dark continent, as the home of doom and gloom. And those stereotypes are served daily by Western media narratives.
Right. What do you say to somebody that says, well, there are journalists who are not from the continent, who are based on the continent, so they have first-hand information, but we're still not quite getting it right? Why is that?
I think it's because I really do firmly believe this. Western media is inherently racist. It's inherently anti-black and anti-African. Therefore, it does not matter that they have a representative on the continent. The aim is that Africa has to be portrayed in a specific way. And for as long as it's not challenged, that's what they're going to do. A recent example, for instance, is how when Kenya was under attack recently, certain global media powerhouses have covered attacks around the world, particularly in the West, right? There was humanity. There was that innate sense of respecting the space of people who are grieving and giving people the dignity. But with Africa, just scatter the dead bodies everywhere and show them across the world. It's the same thing when poverty and other challenges are experienced in the West and they're reported. You don't see people with bones that you can count. You don't see people so dehumanized, so undignified in that state. Yet when it comes to Africa, that is perpetuated without question. To me, it speaks to the bigger issue. The bigger issue is that Africa simply does not matter, not the humanity of Africa, perhaps the story of Africa, perhaps coming here and getting a particular narrative. But the agenda itself is not about Africans deserve their humanity, we deserve our dignity, or that, in fact, like other parts of the world, like in particular the West, that any good story has to be told all the way through versus just a one-sided narrative. Yet that's what keeps happening with African narratives.
It's only fair that we grade ourselves also on the continent in terms of how we then cover stories of the continent. You have traveled extensively across the continent, hence your book, Vagabond, the travel memoir. What is it that you see in terms of how Africans actually cover their own stories?
I think with digital media, what it has allowed us to do, digital media, including social media, is that it has allowed us to tell ourselves and our stories the way that we experience them. So it's not that we're running away from certain problems that do plague Africa, but we understand that there has to be humanity in there. There has to be empathy, but most importantly, there has to be truth and there has to be variety. So that has given us the tools to be the ones who write our own stories better than others, perhaps. We're able to show ourselves in mourning. We're able to show ourselves celebrating. We're able to highlight not just killers, not just mismanagement, pioneers, innovators, and other people who are uplifting the continent, because then that gives us room to show the real Africa. We live here. This is our home. We're not just, I'm not just talking about a fantasy because I happen to be obsessed with Africa. You know, we know that this continent is not just misery, it's not just starvation, and we know that behind every crisis there is often a lot of work going on behind to also find a solution, to create solutions. It's just that those stories do not matter to Western media. Our problem is that we let Western media set the narrative for us, and that is their prerogative, but that cannot be where we primarily consume reflections of ourselves.
In the same breath, though, we do have some stories, or we do find situations that actually take us back as a continent. And as much as so much work has been done, we still have to do more. Are we saying then we do not tell the stories in the name of telling the good story?
No, you tell every story. You absolutely tell every story that matters. What you do not do is forget your empathy, forget your humanity, and yet apply that principle when it comes to telling stories that are closer to your home. So, for instance, with the recent crash of Ethiopian Airlines, a lot of commentators were saying a lot of things. Some of them said this brings to question the issue of safety with that particular airline. This particular airline has not had an issue with their safety record, you know. But one accident, deadly as it is, suddenly the whole aviation in Africa is in shambles. Suddenly there are questions being asked. Will Ethiopians fly the national airline again? When the Twin Towers went down, the question was, will Americans fly in those airlines again? It was understood that, tragic as it is, life goes on, and it was not necessarily a reflection of the airline itself. You know, there are millions of other examples that we can think of and that we see. Perhaps we see so much and engage with so much that we've even stopped questioning them, and we maybe even give airtime to them because we don't switch off commentators who speak nonsense, frankly. You know, we let them go on, we give them airtime as if to say, yes, we know the truth, but we need this particular agenda and narrative to be validated.
In terms of traveling the continent, it's a very difficult time for the media space in terms of budgets and whatnot. Not to say that that is an excuse, but what is it that made you want to change the narrative, travel the continent and tell the story?
Because I cannot accept that image of Africa as doom and gloom. You know, on an emotional level, this continent is my home, and I'm very, very emotionally attached to it. But I also live here. I'm a black woman, I'm well educated, I'm well traveled, and I have a fabulous life, frankly. And yet, you will watch certain American programs by black American shows, and they'll pose questions like in the script, would you rather be middle class in Africa or black in the ghetto? You know, and I'm like, sweetheart, where do you come off looking down on me or thinking that me being in Africa is some measure of how well you are doing? You do not even have a fraction of what I have. You have not begun to conceive of achieving what I have. But because I'm an African, because we are African, automatically we are just nobody. So I wanted to travel because I will not accept that stereotype. But also I will not stand aside and comment from the sidelines. It's one thing and as Africans we always have this conversation, Western media doesn't cover us properly, it's unfair and all of those things, but what do we do? You know what I mean? I wasn't going to stand on the sidelines. I wanted to not only speak against that, but to use my time, my work, my output to actively write stories that we all as Africans relate to, stories of hope, of home, of celebration, of happiness, of laughter. Sometimes, yes, misery, sometimes, yes, strife, but at the end of the day, without taking away our humanity, without forgetting my empathy at the door, just because I'm walking into a refugee camp.
I think in essence, the point is that we cannot lay it on anyone else's door to tell our stories, but we have to tell them ourselves. Perhaps your message to everyday Africans in terms of documenting and telling their stories. You don't need to be a journalist to tell a story about where you come from or who you are.
Absolutely, especially with the digital tools that we have now, especially with technology. Everyone can tell their own story and tell it truthfully, whatever your truth is. And it's not to say do not tell specific stories or certain stories, whatever your truth is. But in doing that, I hope that you will remember empathy, that you will remember that the person whose life you're documenting is not just a prop in your storyline. They are a human being, and they deserve whatever respect that you want. For instance, I become highly offended when people take pictures of me eating. I want to eat my food
in peace,
without any cameras rolling, right? So shouldn't I afford that same thing to someone else? You know, if I'm in a vulnerable position, I first want to compose myself before someone documents that. It's not that I'm going to pretend that that vulnerability didn't happen. It's just that I want to have power over what is said and projected about me.
Absolutely. Do unto others as you would like to be done unto you.
That's all.
Old African proverb. Lerato Mokgwatle, thank you very much.
Thank you so much
for joining us here on #Africa. Author of a travel memoir titled Vega Bond. Lerato Mokgwatle.